The real reason Prince Philip didn't live with the Queen finally explained. She was the one person he had trusted above all others, the one whose quiet strength had held an empire together for 7 decades. Yet behind the golden gates and candlelit corridors of the palace, something no one had anticipated was unfolding, a gesture so private, so unexpected, that those who witnessed it could barely bring themselves to speak of it afterward. King Charles had made a move, and nothing inside those ancient walls would ever be the same again. Catherine's silent rise within the royal court. Deep within the palace, behind doors that had stood for centuries, something extraordinary was taking shape. King Charles had discreetly summoned a handful of his most trusted senior staff, veterans who had dedicated their lives to serving Queen Elizabeth herself. No explanation was offered, no briefing documents were prepared. The message was simple and absolute. Come immediately. Come quietly. The palace was still. The hour was late. Yet the tension that moved through those stone corridors was almost electric, as though history itself was holding its breath. Ancient rules bent without breaking. Doors ordinarily protected by ceremonial guards were left slightly open, just wide enough for chosen figures to pass through without drawing notice. The king's innermost chambers, rooms so private that even senior courtiers rarely glimpsed their interiors, had been prepared in near total silence. Those who waited later said the only sound they could discern was the soft, rhythmic ticking of the king's private pocket watch. There were no minutes to be taken, no schedule to follow. Only one expectation: complete and uncompromising secrecy. Then she entered. Catherine. Alone. No protection detail trailing behind her, no assistants, no handlers, none of the usual machinery of royalty. She dressed simply, in understated tones, and carried only a single sealed envelope, understood to contain the late Queen's final private bequest, a symbolic gesture from one generation to the next. Palace staff who saw her pass fell still instinctively. Some bowed without being told to. They seemed to understand, in that wordless way that palace life demands, that they were watching a turning point arrive on quiet feet.
Their plans for the royal cellars,
Queen Camilla had been pacing the West Wing
of
corridor, her expression drawn tight with an anger that could not entirely conceal the fear beneath it. She had received no invitation, she had been told nothing. Sources inside the palace would later confirm she sought answers with increasing desperation, but the doors stayed sealed, and the silence offered nothing in return. And behind those closed doors, something that had no name in royal protocol was taking place, something older than ceremony, older than title. Not a coronation, not a formal transfer, but a passing of something that crowns alone cannot carry: legitimacy of spirit, the weight of genuine trust. What occurred in that room would quietly alter the course of the monarchy, not with a proclamation, but with a gesture the world would spend years trying to understand. How Catherine became the monarchy's quiet anchor. While the public was consumed by one royal storm after another, a more subtle transformation had been underway inside the palace walls. Catherine was no longer simply enduring the pressures of royal life. She was rising, deliberately, steadily, with the quiet backing of those who had known the late Queen most intimately. The fractures caused by Harry and Meghan's departure had left a vacuum at the center of the institution. Andrew's ongoing controversies cast long shadows over the family's credibility. Into that turbulence, Catherine stepped, not because she sought the spotlight, but because the monarchy needed someone to hold the line, and she held it. Where others scrambled for relevance or retreated from scrutiny, Catherine offered something increasingly rare within those walls: composure. Her judgment, once politely overlooked in senior meetings, had begun to quietly shape outcomes. Advisors who had once privately questioned whether a commoner could ever truly grasp the demands of the crown now found themselves turning to her first. It was Princess Anne who first recognized what Catherine carried within her. Away from press coverage and public events, Anne began guiding her in the older, stricter traditions of royal service: endurance, discipline, and above all, the art of discretion. Prince Edward played his own part, walking alongside her through palace grounds, sharing knowledge that had never been written down and was never intended for outside ears. These were not idle conversations between relatives, they were deliberate acts of preparation, quiet transfers of institutional memory conducted in whispers and garden paths. With each passing month, Catherine's command of constitutional detail, diplomatic sensitivity, and ceremonial obligation deepened to a level that surprised even those who had watched her closely for years. And slowly, without announcement, loyalty began to shift, not because anyone had instructed it to, but because those who had served the crown for decades could sense where its future resided. The foundation Queen Elizabeth laid in secret. Long before anyone dared to speak about it openly, the late queen had already formed her own quiet conclusion. Her presence lingered through the palace long after her passing, in the habits of her staff, in the unspoken expectations that shaped every formal occasion, and in words she had left behind that very few had ever been permitted to read. A handwritten note, secured in a private safe and known only to her most trusted legal advisor and to Princess Anne, contained a single guiding instruction for those who would carry the crown forward. Trust the one with unshakable grace. Many believed, without being told, that she had been thinking of Catherine. In her final months, those who attended the Queen closely noted that she spoke of Catherine with a frequency and warmth that distinguished her from the rest. And when the Commonwealth required a steady representative, someone who could project unity at a moment of political fragility, it was Catherine who was chosen, not Camilla, Catherine. Former governors-general spoke of her instinctive dignity. Visiting diplomats remarked on her genuine respect for long-standing tradition. Even members of the Queen's personal clergy noted her spiritual attentiveness and quiet commitment. Yet throughout her growing influence, Catherine maintained a careful distance from the court's internal politics. She refused to be pulled into factional disputes. She protected her children from unnecessary exposure and preserved an unblemished public record. She kept her alliances private and her ambitions invisible to the press. This was not timidity, it was precision. While others sought visibility, Catherine was building something more durable, readiness. And no one, even the shrewdest observers inside the palace, fully anticipated what that readiness would produce when the defining moment finally arrived. That moment arrived when King Charles lowered himself to one knee before her. The fracturing of Camilla's position. For Camilla, the impact was swift and severe. Decades of carefully constructed influence, hard-won through years of public criticism, scandal, and gradual rehabilitation, began to collapse within hours. The signs had gathered for days before the ceremony itself. Meetings she had previously chaired were quietly reassigned. Her name disappeared from invitation lists she had once taken for granted. Senior protocol officials who had long deferred to her judgment began consulting figures aligned with Catherine instead. The shrinkage of her inner circle, once a reliable constellation of loyal allies, became impossible to ignore. Tension erupted approximately 72 hours before the private ceremony. Witnesses described a confrontation between Camilla and King Charles in which voices were raised and composure abandoned. She demanded to know why she had been excluded from strategic decisions that she believed fell within her authority. Charles's reported reply was brief and devastating. Some roles were never meant to be permanent. She attempted to intervene. She contacted senior staff, she summoned the royal security chief and pressed for information, but the landscape had already shifted beneath her. Those who had once acted on her word without hesitation now paused. The machinery of palace power, so long accustomed to her direction, had quietly been redirected. The ceremony that rewrote everything. No one outside that room prepared for what Charles did. In the early hours of the morning, by candlelight, in a chamber stripped of all ceremonial decoration, Charles stood before Catherine not as a monarch, but as a man. He had removed the outward symbols of his sovereignty. His hands, those who were present later said, were trembling, not from frailty, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He sank to one knee. The words he spoke were not taken from any protocol document or prepared by any speechwriter. They came from somewhere older and more private. "You are the future I failed to protect." Catherine's expression, by all accounts, was not of triumph. It was disbelief. The man who had once viewed her presence with quiet ambivalence was now placing the moral inheritance of the crown directly in her hands. He reached into his pocket and produced a ring, not among the official crown jewels, but a piece that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth personally, a private treasure, chosen for its symbolism rather than its value: clarity, foresight, unbroken service. In placing it in Catherine's palm, Charles said without words what no formal proclamation could capture. 2 staff members, summoned quietly by Princess Anne, bore witness. One wept, the other recorded. Catherine did not bow, she did not smile. She stood in the silence of that extraordinary moment and absorbed what had just been entrusted to her. Not a title, not a formal role,